I've been warning about this issue for a while, but I'm afraid the real estate bubble burst in China. And so the situation is very similar to what happened to Japan 30 years ago. When real estate prices started falling, Chinese people who bought these apartments and houses suddenly realized that their wealth is falling, balance sheet is underwater, so they start paying down debt. I really want to write to the Chinese central bank by saying that the market is trying to tell you that this is a balance sheet recession and that government spending is needed, and the central bank will not have much impact one way or the other. So the economy is still weakening quite rapidly.
Hey everyone, before we get into it, I do have some big news. This will be my final episode of Forward Guidance. The very talented Felix Javin, in whom I have complete and utter confidence, will be taking over as host of Forward Guidance going forward. I'll be leaving to start my own financial podcast and YouTube channel called Monetary Matters, which will include links to in the description. Oh, and by the way, if you already know what a balance sheet recession is and you want to get immediately to the China part in this interview, skip to the 15-minute mark. I wouldn't do that, but just so you know. All right, let's get into it. I am so pleased to welcome to Forward Guidance for the first time Richard Koo, Chief Economist at the Nomura Research Institute and Senior Advisor at CSIS. A former economist with the Federal Reserve, Richard has advised former Fed Chair Paul Volcker as well as 5 Japanese prime ministers. He notably is the founder of the concept of a balance sheet recession, a significant advancement in the field of macroeconomics and recession theory. Richard, thank you so much for joining us here today. Welcome to Forward Guidance.
Well, thank you for having me. It's a great pleasure.
The pleasure is all mine. Richard, let's start off the concept of a balance sheet recession. You first discovered this, very relevant to what happened in post-bubble economies such as the Japan in the 1990s, as well as Western economies after the great financial crisis, as well as perhaps China right now. So what is a balance sheet recession and how does it apply to all those regions?
I came up with this concept of balance sheet recession around 1997 or so, 1996, 1997, trying to understand what was going on in Japan. And as a chief economist of Nomura, the largest investment bank in Japan, I had to be able to explain what was happening all around us after the bubble burst. The bubble burst 1990, and the economy kept on slowing down. Bank of Japan brought rates down to zero fairly quickly. Nothing happened. We had a fiscal stimulus, but every time you put in the fiscal stimulus, the economy responded. But when you removed it, it tanked again. No so-called pump priming, the Keynesian pump priming that we come to expect. And of course, structural policies were discussed and actually implemented, but nothing helped. And so we were completely lost at that time, what was happening to us. And then one day I looked at how much money Japanese companies are actually raising from the capital market and the banking system. And I was shocked to find that the number was actually negative at zero interest rates, meaning that Japanese companies are actually paying down debt at zero interest rates. And nothing in economics that I studied in graduate schools prepared me for something like this. So that got me start thinking. And well, the only possibility that can explain this kind of phenomenon is that they have balance sheet problems, financial problems, that they are possibly technically bankrupt, then in that case, you have to pay down debt to come out of this negative equity territory. And so then that was the starting point. And then I started looking into and asking questions to a lot of corporate executives. And I found out that none of them are particularly willing to talk about that subject because they, of course, don't want to tell the whole world that they are technically bankrupt and they're actually paying down debt, not maximizing profits. They're minimizing debt. But then you gather data from flow funds, banking numbers. What happened was during the bubble, people leveraged themselves up, thinking that they're going to make tons of money. But once the bubble burst, liabilities remain, asset prices collapse, and they realize their balance sheet's underwater. Well, balance sheets underwater means these guys are bankrupt, technically bankrupt. There are actually 2 kinds of bankruptcies when you think about it. The one with cash flow and the one without cash flow. Now, without cash flow, of course, you're out of business right away, and then you have to step off the stage. But if your main line of business is still doing okay, that your cars and cameras are still selling very well, which was the case for the Japanese companies back in 1990s, but the balance sheet is horribly underwater because of this wrong decision that management made in investing in certain properties and so forth. In that case, what is the right thing to do? The right thing to do is for these companies to use the cash flow to pay down debt. And as long as you can pay down debt slowly and slowly, at some point your balance sheets will be balanced again. And then you go back to the original profit maximization instead of debt minimization. But when you're in that process, you're actually minimizing debt. But that is the right thing to do at the individual level, in that by doing so, you don't have to tell your shareholders, it's all piece of paper now. You don't have to tell bankers that, sorry, I can't service your debt. It's all non-performing loans. And most importantly, you don't have to tell your workers that you have no more jobs tomorrow. So for all the individual or the stakeholders involved, that is the right thing to do. Whether you're Japanese, American, or German, or Taiwanese, that is the right thing to do. And it's a responsible thing to do as well. But the problem is, what happens when everybody does this all at the same time? Because in the national economy, if someone is saving money, someone has to be borrowing and spending that money to keep the economy going, right? And usually, those of us in the financial sector will take the money from the savers, give it to someone who can use it. That's how economy moves forward. And if there are too many borrowers and the economy is doing well, central bank will raise interest rates. Too few borrowers, central bank will bring rates down. And that's basically how economy usually functions. But in a balance sheet recession, central bank bring rates down to zero. Nothing happens because all these people are still paying down debt, repairing balance sheets. And when you're in that situation, the economy could tank very, very quickly. Then if I may give you a numerical example, suppose I have $1,000 of income myself and I spend $900, save $100. The $900 is already someone else's income, so that's not a problem. But the $100 that I decide to save will go through the financial sector, give it to someone who can use it, that person borrows and spends it, then the total expenditure in the economy will be $900 that I spend, $100 that this borrower spent, $1,000 against the original income of $1,000, and the economy moves forward. But in the balance sheet recession, when I have $1,000 of income and I spend $900, and the $1,000 I saved, this $100 gets stuck in the financial sector. It cannot come out because people are not borrowing money, even at zero interest rates. Then the economy shrinks from 1,000 to 900. The 900 is someone's income. If that person says, okay, let's save 10%, spends 810 and saves $90, the $90 gets stuck in the financial system. And it happens like this because repairing balance sheets typically takes a long time. Japan took, in some companies, nearly 20 years. And US, Europe, after 2008, also took 5 to 6 years in the case of the United States, much longer in Europe. And so if nothing is done to this situation, the economy could go from 1,900, 810, 730 very, very quickly. And that's basically what happened to the United States during the Great Depression, when everybody was paying down debt, no one was borrowing money, and the economy lost 46% of its GDP in just 4 years, from 1929 to 1933. That's why it was called the Great Depression. But no one understood this process at the time, and not until 1997 or so, because we always assume the private sector is maximizing profits. If real rates are low enough, someone would borrow money and the economy will move forward. Well, once you're in balance sheet recession with people having huge problems with their balance sheets, that fundamental premise, fundamental assumption is violated. And we have to operate on the assumption that private sector is not maximizing profits, they're actually minimizing debt. And that's basically the key point of the balance sheet recession.
So in a balance sheet recession, the private sector, which includes households as well as businesses, is deleveraging and paying down debt. Economics 101, mainstream economics theory, traditionally had the theory that businesses are always maximizing profits. But you're saying in some instances, after a recession, after the burst of a bubble, they really want to pay down debt, even if they would make more money and make more profits by borrowing more money. When interest rates are really low, they de-lever. How did you see that concept play out after the great financial crisis in Europe as well as the United States?
Well, so the bubble burst 2008, especially after the Lehman crisis. That was September of 2008. And all these households suddenly decide not to borrow money, start paying down debt. And both in the United States and Europe, if you look at the flow of funds data, there was a dramatic change from being a borrower, being a net borrower, to a huge net saver. In the case of Spain, which suffered very badly from this recession, the shift from being a net borrower to a net saver for the Spanish household sector was as large as 20% of GDP. And if the economy loses 20% of GDP almost overnight, of course, the economy will be in very sad shape. And Spanish unemployment rate reached almost 25% shortly thereafter. And of course, US, we all know how much US suffered. Many other countries in Europe suffered as well because the housing bubble burst on both sides of the Atlantic almost at the same time.
Is a solution to a balance sheet recession one where the government borrows a lot of money because there are no private sector borrowers who want to lever up?
The problem with balance sheet recession is that everybody's doing the right thing, right and responsible and honorable thing. That is to repair their balance sheets with their cash flow so that at some point your balance sheet's balanced again. So it's very difficult to tell to the private sector, please stop borrowing money and don't repair your balance sheets. Even if the government or even the dictator tell them to do that, that's not going to happen. And if you remember, the banks are also not allowed to lend money to a bankrupt borrower. If bank examiner finds out that you're lending money to the bankrupt borrower, you go to jail. And so lenders cannot move, the borrowers cannot move, and they're all doing the right things. Then the only way to stop this 1,900, 810, 730 that process is for the government to borrow the $100. If the government borrowed the $100, then it'd be $900 plus $100,000 against the original income of $1,000. The economy will remain stable. And this has to be continued until private sector balance sheets are repaired and they're back borrowing money again. But that's going to be a fairly long process. If you do it correctly from the very beginning, when the GDP is largely maintained, then it might take less time. But if you allow the economy to really collapse first, and then you try to rebuild it with the government spending, then it will take much longer and it'll be much costlier as well.
Do you think the U.S. has emerged from the balance sheet recession it was in from the great financial crisis onwards?
Compared to U.S. and Europe, United States actually did the right thing. Chairman Bernanke of the Federal Reserve, for example, came out and said, please don't fall off the fiscal cliff. You know, that very famous quote, fiscal cliff? Well, he understood that we were in balance sheet recession. He actually read my book, and we actually testified together at U.S. Congress one time. So with that remark, at the time, if you remember, Republicans were trying to balance the budget, as they have done during the Great Depression, tried to do during the Great Depression. But Chairman Bernanke, who was put in place with Republican support, were actually telling the Republicans, don't do that. Don't try to cut the deficit drastically. This is no time to cut the deficit. And that kept the U.S. Congress from really going down the route of austerity. And I think that's how U.S. came out of that recession much faster than the Europeans. It still took 5, 6, 7 years, if you look at the data on when people start borrowing money again. But 5, 6 years is far better than almost 10 or 12 years that Europeans took. And in the case of Europe, if you remember, there's this Growth and Stability Pact, which caps how much individual Eurozone member countries can borrow. And that's set at 3% of GDP. But at the time, as I indicated to you earlier, the Spanish private sector was saving 7% of GDP at zero interest rates. But the government was only allowed to borrow 3% out of the 7. So what happens to the remaining 4%? Well, that became the deflationary gap of the Spanish economy. And that's how the Spanish economy literally collapsed. In spite of my repeated warnings to the European governments and to the ECB, I was invited to speak at the ECB on numerous occasions because they also realized that they might be facing balance sheet recession. Even though people at the researcher level, economists, many of them understood that this is this new disease called balance sheet recession, the top guys, the German government, refused to listen to that and kept on talking about austerity and structural reform. Now, structural reform sounds great, and I have nothing against structural reform per se, but if the issue is who's going to borrow the $100 in a hurry, and if you put in a structural reform, if that structural reform just happened to prompt people to borrow the $100 and spend it, then it would have worked. But it's very difficult to predict something like that happening. And even though Europeans did do a lot of structural reforms, labor market reforms, so forth, the economy continued to weaken and stayed very weak for almost 10 years, perhaps 10, 11 years, before things began to look better. The difference in fiscal policy between United States on one hand and Europeans on the other, I think makes it very, very clear that in a situation like a balance sheet recession, fiscal policy is the only way to go.
And as we record this during the summer of 2024, we're looking back at the balance sheet recessions in the West after the great financial crisis of 2008. We're looking back at the balance sheet recession of Japan after the burst of the bubble in the early 1990s. But what about China right now? Is China on the precipice of a balance sheet recession, and why?
Well, I've been warning about this issue for a while, but I'm afraid the real estate bubble burst in China. And so the situation is very similar to what happened to Japan 30 years ago. When real estate prices started falling, Chinese people who bought these apartments and houses suddenly realized that their wealth is falling, balance sheet is underwater, so they start paying down debt. There's a slight difference between Japan and China in that in the Japanese case, it was the commercial real estate that really led the bubble. But in the Chinese case, it was the housing. And so it was the individuals that were beginning to pay down debt. But Chinese statistics, especially flow of funds data, are not coming out quickly enough. So it's very difficult to determine what is actually happening. But we are now hearing that not only many people are not borrowing money or paying down debt, even with these very low interest rates in China, which is exactly the same as what happened in Japan 30 years earlier, the bond rates are coming down to the 10-year Chinese government bond rate is down to like 2.1%. Now, for a developing country like China, which still has lots of investment opportunities, and they have lots of companies that are highly competitive on the export market, they should be borrowing and spending and expanding their capacities. The bond yield coming down to 2.1% means these private sector sorts are not borrowing money, actually paying down debt. And as a result, this money comes back into the financial sector. But those fund managers in financial institutions cannot find a place to place these funds because private sector as a group is no longer borrowing money, it's actually paying down debt. Then the only borrower left is the government. And so in the balance sheet recession, one of the key characteristics of balance sheet recession is that government bond yields come down to these ridiculously low levels. We saw that in US, from 2008 all the way to 2022 or so. That's basically what's happening in China today. But for some reason, the Chinese central bank does not want to think that it's a balance sheet recession and are telling people that this bond market is a bubble. Don't buy into it. I really want to write to the Chinese central bank by saying that the market is trying to tell you that this is a balance sheet recession and that government spending is needed, and the central bank will not have much impact one way or the other. Because if people are not borrowing money, monetary policy is largely ineffective. We were not taught that during our university days, but looking at what happened to Japan or what happened to the United States and Europe after 2008, even though central bank brought rates down to zero, there were very little pickup in borrowing in all of these regions. And for monetary policy to work, someone has to be out there. There has to be borrowers out there who would respond to, higher interest rates or lower interest rates, and it's their response that produces the effect of monetary policy. Interest rates increases and decreases alone are actually neutral because it's just the transfer of income from debtors to creditors or creditor to the debtors. And since the amount of the gain on one side and amount of loss on the other is exactly the same amount, it should be neutral. So interest rates increases or decreases alone should be neutral to the economy. But if there are borrowers out there who would respond to this changing signals from the central bank, and if they change their behavior, then we can see monetary policy acting on the economy. But if these borrowers all absent themselves because they're all repairing balance sheets, then you bring rates down to zero, nothing happens. And you do need the fiscal policy to offset this $100 that I mentioned to you earlier. And huge number of Chinese have read my book. All 5 of my English books were translated into Chinese. They're doing very well, actually. Even though many academics, many people in the private sector are fully cognizant of the fact that they're facing balance sheet recession, and many government economists also are aware of this fact, somehow they haven't been able to put together sufficiently large fiscal stimulus to stabilize the economy. So the economy is still weakening quite rapidly.
That's the point about a balance sheet recession, as well as just a macroeconomic economy in general, is that, as you write in your book, Pursued Economy, 1 + 1 does not equal 2. If I am saving money and you are saving money and everyone else in the economy is saving money, that does not increase the savings of the entire economy. Actually, the economy shrinks because people are not spending enough money. And that's why in a balance sheet recession, there needs to be someone to be borrowing money, someone to be spending money, because if everyone is saving at the same time, households, businesses, corporations, then the economy shrinks. So China is in a balance sheet recession right now. How do you see this playing out? Because you've got these fantastic charts showing the surpluses and deficits of households, of corporations, of the government, as well as the rest of the world. And we can put that on the chart on the screen right now for our viewers. And it shows how, starting in 1990, the Japanese corporate sector, which was running a huge deficit, i.e., borrowing money and stimulating growth, began to save, and they actually, households and the corporations were running a surplus at the same time, which was very contractionary. Do you think that in a few years, the Chinese economy will have the same thing, where households are saving money and corporations are saving money too? And we can also put up the same chart, but for China.
Yes, you already mentioned what happened to Japan, and that is that when Japan was doing very well, household sector was saving money, corporate sector was borrowing money, and the economy was moving very nicely forward. China had that pattern until around 2016. And after 2016, for some reason, Chinese companies stopped borrowing money or stopped deleveraging, in a sense that they start reducing their borrowings. And by 2021 or so, 2021, they were actually net savers. And this is long before the balance sheet recession actually came into play, because at that time, the housing bubble was still growing. In some sense, Chinese economy was kind of experiencing balance sheet recession type problem even before the balance sheet recession started in 2022, 2023, because at that time, house prices are still rising. As a result, from 2016 to 2021, that period, government had to borrow and spend the money to keep the economy going. So even though Chinese economy looked pretty strong, pretty stable from 2016 to 2021 or so, it was actually supported by government spending. And as a result, general government budget deficit, general government financial deficit was almost like 7% of GDP before the balance sheet recession happened. And that may be one of the reasons why Chinese government is reluctant to put in more fiscal stimulus, because if you start with the deficit 7% of GDP to begin with, and then you have to add, let's say, 5% of GDP stimulus, that would give you the budget deficit 12% of GDP. Even if you fully understand that during a balance sheet recession, government has to borrow and spend money, if you are shown this number that if you do this, the budget deficit could be 12% of GDP, then people get scared. And I think that's one of the reasons why Chinese haven't really put in the necessary fiscal stimulus, because even before the balance sheet recession began, budget deficit was already very large. And this budget deficit was also concentrated in the local, regional, and local governments, not at the central government level. These local governments, provincial governments are almost all bankrupt at this very moment. Even if the central government tells the regional government, hey, do more infrastructure building, do this and do that, local governments are saying, sorry, we don't have the money. And so central government has to really take on this additional responsibility, but apparently they are not yet willing to do so. And as a result, the Chinese economy is continuing to lose its forward momentum.
Richard, in China, from what I've read and heard, the household savings rate is extraordinarily high, and they have an investment-driven model. Those savings are loaned out to businesses which have invested heavily in infrastructure and real estate, and lending to local governments, regional governments, as you just said. Looking at this chart now, I was surprised that the Chinese household savings rate was only 15% of GDP. I thought I've heard that the savings rate was 30% or maybe even higher. And also, can you speak to just how levered the Chinese economy has been and how dependent on bank credit growth and making real estate loans the Chinese economy has been? Many people say the U.S. is economically unsustainable because we have so much debt, and that is true on a federal government level. But private sector debt and bank credit debt has not been growing that much up until recently. And actually, as you say, that's part of the problem. That's why we had a balance sheet recession, because bank credit growth has not been growing. However, in China, it has been growing like a weed since the 2000s. That's my understanding.
Well, there are a lot of people out there who make this big issue out of the size of the debt, that is, 100%, 200%, 300% of GDP, and so forth. I am not particularly fond of that kind of argument, because if there's someone saving money, someone has to be borrowing money. And it's very difficult to convince household sector in any country, whether it's in the United States or Japan or China, not to save. Because if they are not comfortable, or if they think that they have to have enough insurance to make sure that they can, live through rainy days and old age, they will save it no matter what the government says. When I was at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, the U.S. thought that U.S. households are not saving enough, and they came out with all sorts of instruments, all savers account and so forth, the tax-free this and this and that. That allows the money to move around among the household wealth, but the net number hardly ever changed. So we know from the fact that household savings behavior is very, very difficult to change. It has lots of cultural, historical, other factors behind it. So the only thing that can change is the corporate sector side and the government side. When the economy is developing with lots of investment opportunities, corporate sector will be very busy borrowing money so that they can invest and expand their business. And that was the case in Japan all the way until 1990s. In the case of China until 2016 that I mentioned to you earlier. So in that case, household sector is saving something like 10% of GDP according to the flow of funds. I'm not talking about the savings rate, because savings rate is a very difficult number to play with in my view. I like to look at whether the sector is in financial surplus or financial deficit, because that's the exact amount that was actually saved or borrowed. And household sector in China was was running financial surplus around 10, 12% of GDP fairly consistently. But as long as corporate sector is borrowing and spending it and expanding the business with that, and if they're careful with their borrowing so that they actually make money so that they can pay back debt, then there's absolutely no problem with the size of the debt. In fact, it's good that corporate sector was borrowing money because you cannot tell the household sector not to save money. But what's the problem now is that corporate sector is no longer borrowing money in China. But the household sector continues to save. And so if the government did not come in to borrow, Chinese economy will be in a deflationary cycle. As I mentioned to you earlier, that 1,900, 810, 730, that process. And so the size of the debt is not my primary concern. My primary concern is whether whatever that is saved is borrowed and spent, and if the money is borrowed and spent, whether the money is spent wisely. I think those are the factors that one should watch, not the size of the debt.
Thank you. And Richard, in the US, which we think of as a free market economy, if CEOs and corporate executives don't want to borrow money, they don't want to invest and spend money, they want to hoard savings, and they want to save money to pay down debt, governments can whine about that, but it's really is the corporate executives, even if they're wrong to do so, and it will cause a recession, exacerbate a recession, they're going to do what they're going to do. In China, there's a perception it is a command and control economy, that the government tells banks how much to lend and to whom to lend. So is it possible that China, Beijing, could reverse this balance sheet recession by telling banks to lend lend more to real estate, lend even more to investing in electric vehicles and additive manufacturing and new technologies? In other words, is the balance sheet recession that China is undergoing right now, is it a man-made phenomenon of the private sector is not borrowing because the government's telling them not to borrow? They're telling banks not to extend credit, rather than it being a psychological phenomenon of deflation and saving?
Well, actually, Chinese government is trying to tell the banks to lend more because they are afraid that if the banks don't lend more, we'll fall into a balance sheet recession. And the banks, many of them are, of course, government-owned, have to come up with the numbers indicating that they are lending money. So what happened, apparently, was that these banks will lend money to state-owned enterprises, SOEs. But SOEs cannot find attractive investment opportunity for those funds. So they put the money back into the bank to collect interest. And as a result, if you look at the money supply and bank lending numbers in China, both of them are growing, very close to each other. And that was because of this particular behavior. The banks are lending money to meet the government's target, but the corporations are borrowing it or just putting the money back into the banks. So the banks have more money to lend, and very little money was actually spent on real projects because they are also worried that if they did that, they might end up, becoming a non-performing loans. And only recently, apparently, Chinese government realized that, these numbers are basically cooked by the bankers and then the SOEs. So they said, don't do that anymore. And suddenly, the lending numbers are beginning to turn negative because the amount outstanding is turning negative because there's no more reason to, increase both sides of the balance sheets with no real economic significance. And so we are beginning to see what is really happening in China because this funny game that they played with those bank lending numbers are now being corrected.
Hello, everyone. Permissionless 3 is coming to Salt Lake City on October 9th. The event for crypto natives is heading west, and we are bringing the biggest names in crypto together for an insane, can't-miss event. Hear from more than 200 industry titans, including Balaji, Mike Novogratz, and Dan Tapiero. The conversations at Permissionless will be covering the hottest themes in crypto, including modularity, restaking, the Bitcoin and Solana ecosystems, AI and crypto, rollups and L2s, institutional adoption, and of course the November election that will be right around the corner. We couldn't be more excited about this event. Get your ticket today and make sure I get some bragging rights by using my code FG10 to get 10% off. That's FG10. Stands for Forward Guidance. I want to see you there. Do it. It's going to be at one of the most beautiful places in the United States, and everyone's going to be there. Van Spencer's going to be there. Jim Bianco's going to be there. Jan Van Eck's going to be there. So what are you waiting for? Get your tickets now by clicking the link in the description and use code FG10. Back to the episode. And then now let's introduce a fourth element to the financial surplus or deficit by sector, which is the current account, sometimes referred to as trade deficit plus services with the rest of the world. So as many people know, the US runs a very large trade deficit with the rest of the world. China runs and has run a very large trade surplus with the rest of the world. Can you explain how this factors into your analysis, as well as the significance of companies not being able to find attractive domestic investments and them instead directing capital abroad? And then we'll have a very interesting conversation about trade and trade wars and whether the era of free trade is coming to an end.
If your economy is in recession and you have a very competitive export industries, which China does have, natural tendency for the government is to export your way out, right? And that's exactly the same situation in Japan in 1990s. Japan had highly competitive export industries. People wanted to buy Japanese cars, Japanese cameras. So Japanese government obviously wanted to export its way out instead of running a larger budget deficit. Well, we learned that that did not work very well. And the reason is that Japan at that time, 30 years ago, and China today are both the largest country, the country with largest current account surplus. And when you're the country running the largest current account surplus, trade surplus, and if this country tries to increase its export to basically export unemployment, all the other countries will start complaining that you already are destabilizing the global trading system. Now you want to destabilize it even more. And that's basically what's behind so-called US-Japan trade friction back in early 1990s. And I was very much part of it, representing the US position in Japan. So I know how ugly that trade friction got at that time. And that also taught the Japanese that even though exporting its way out is the easy way, that option was not available to them because it was already the largest trade surplus country in the world. Now, this contrasts with South Korea in 1997. South Korea in 1997 was facing this Asian currency crisis, and asset prices in Korea collapsed. People had to repair their balance sheets. So Korean economy was falling into a balance sheet recession. But at that time, in 1997, Korea was running a huge trade deficit. And so when Korean won collapsed and it lost like 60% of its value during the Asian currency crisis, Korea could use that fall in the currency to export its way out. And if you live that period, you can go back and look at some of the magazine ads during that period. And the Korean car companies like Hyundai was putting two Hyundais on side of the page and one Japanese car on the other side of the page, and saying, hey, you can buy two Hyundais for the price of one Toyota. You know, they were running that kind of ads because of what happened to the exchange rate. And the US and other countries really couldn't complain to the Koreans because Korea was running a large trade deficit. So if you are a deficit country, you have the option of using the exports to export your way out of balance sheet recession, as the Koreans and other Asian countries have done after 1997. But if you're a surplus country, and not just a surplus country, the biggest surplus country in the world, I'm afraid that option is not available politically. And I think Chinese government is also aware of that. In spite of all the problems that China has domestically, the central bank is trying to keep the RMB, the Chinese currency, from falling. Because if it does fall, and if Chinese companies then try to export their way out, that will cause even bigger problems down the road. And Chinese government apparently is aware of this risk. And so they're trying to keep the RMB, which if there was no central bank, I'm sure RMB would be a lot lower in value, but their central bank is trying to keep it at this stable level, just about 7.2 or so with the US dollar, because they know that the political situation is not allowing China to export its way out.
So China can't export its way out of a balance sheet recession because it already is the world leader in exports in running a trade surplus. So they can't run even bigger because that would have political consequences, unlike Korea, which was a trade deficit country. And then when their currency weakened, that weak currency supports exports, so then they could export their way out. But China cannot. When you say that China doesn't want to export more because it will have political consequences, are you talking about domestically political problems or problems between China and Europe and China and the United States?
It's the latter.
Okay.
I mean, I'm sure individual Japanese companies or individual Chinese companies will be desperate to export their way out because domestic demand is so weak as a result of domestic balance sheet recession. But external environment was not at all friendly at that time. I mean, I was representing the U.S. positions at that time to a Japanese television audience at the request of the U.S. ambassador to Japan at that time, Mr. Walter Mondale. He asked me that someone carrying American passport but was appearing frequently in the Japanese television. So he asked me, can you represent our position in the Japanese TV? So that's what I did for a number of years. Every time the Japanese television program wanted to do something about U.S.-Japan trade friction, I was asked to go to embassy first, get the full briefing on all sorts of issues, and then went to the TV studios. And when you enter TV studios, all these Japanese are waiting with their guns to shoot me down. It was a horrendous experience, but I learned a lot about trade in those years. It was not a very pleasant time to be doing that. I got lots of death threats, telephones, and it was very intense. But of course, the Japanese bureaucrats, Japanese government officials realized that Japan, with the largest trade surplus in the world, cannot export its way out.
Why is an export leader such as Japan used to be, or now China is, why can't they export even more? What is so bad economically for the rest of the world about running very large trade deficits with the rest of the world?
If you care about your GDP and your country is running a large deficit, a trade deficit, that deficit number is subtracted when you're compiling GDP. But if you are having trade surplus, it's added to your GDP. So trade deficit or trade surplus has a direct impact on the amount of GDP, economic growth, and so forth. So if you are a country running large deficit year after year, that means your GDP is not growing as fast or actually shrinking in some cases. And naturally, that will not be good for your country, especially if the deficit is due to import of consumer goods, right? If you're importing capital goods, you'll be adding to productive capacity later. And so you might tolerate this trade deficit. And that was basically the case of South Korea until 1997. South Korea was importing huge amounts of capital goods from Japan, United States, and Europe to rebuild its, or not rebuild, to enlarge their manufacturing capacity. But as a result, the country itself was running a trade deficit. But if you're running a deficit with mostly due to consumer goods, you're not really preparing for your future, but you're just losing the income and employment. And so most governments under most circumstances, will try to limit the trade deficit from growing too large for too long.
But the U.S., as my understanding, has not, and the U.S. trade deficit and current account deficit has widened remarkably over the past 45 years. And it's been part of the U.S. policy that's not only fine, but in some instances, it's a good thing, because if China can produce sneakers cheaper than they can produce them in Pennsylvania, then Americans save money, and that's a good thing, right?
Well, United States is the only exception to the rule that I mentioned to you earlier. That is, if the trade is driven by, if the trade deficit is largely consumer goods, then you want to make sure that you don't run deficit for too long. While United States is the only country in the world which allowed trade deficit to continue for over 40 years. The last time U.S. had a trade surplus, trade balance, was in the late 70s. And since then, for the last 40 years or so, it was running in huge deficit year after year after year. What that means is that if U.S. had a balanced trade, U.S. GDP should have been much larger than where we are seeing now. And because it kept on running deficit for that long, those people who were directly competing with foreign producers, like manufacturers in Midwest, farmers, they were hit very badly during this period. Whereas if you're city dwellers or in IT industry or service industry, banking, financial stuff, and you're not directly exposed to this trade deficit issues. And so for those people, trade deficit was not a big issue. But for the people who had to compete with imports, it was a huge issue.
You write that how after the Bretton Woods agreement, there was supposed to be a mechanism of currencies being corrected. So in other words, if one country was running a giant trade surplus and it was hurting the rest of the world, that country would be instructed or encouraged to strengthen their currencies to make the rest of the world more competitive and that country slightly less competitive. And then in 1971, when the world officially went on the floating exchange rates and the U.S. went off gold, that was supposed to be the mechanism. But you write about how now when the U.S. is running a deficit with China has all of these excessive dollars, which if cross-capital flows were only based on the trade channel, a trade of goods and services, then the Chinese yuan, the renminbi, would strengthen enormously against the dollar, making U.S. exports once again competitive and restoring that balance. But you write how for 40 years, because of capital flows, financial flows, not related to trade, that adjustment mechanism has been severely impaired. Tell us about that.
Well, when the original so-called free trade system was put together under this notion GATT, that was 1948, when some countries start running large surplus and other countries suffering from deficit. Originally, the adjustment was supposed to take place through transfer of gold, and if the gold is leaving the country gets scared. So it would tighten its monetary policy, tighten its belt, and that's how the original adjustment was supposed to take place. But the competitiveness of Europeans and Japanese, who were devastated after World War II, of course, became much more competitive once their industries were rebuilt, often with the U.S. help. Then U.S. began to run large deficits, and that resulted in U.S. coming out of gold and allowing foreign exchange to move more freely to make sure that the trade balance doesn't go out of whack. The way it worked was that if foreign exchange market is largely dominated by exporters and importers, and if, for example, U.S. is running a large deficit against Japan, the Toyota, who earn all these dollars selling cars in the United States, will have to sell those dollars to get yen. And American companies who are earning yen in Japan have to convert them into dollars. But if the U.S. is running a trade surplus, U.S. is running deficit and Japan is running surplus, the demand for dollar would be very much less than the demand for yen from people like Toyota and Nissan selling dollars to buy yen to pay their workers back in home in yen. And that will push dollar lower, yen higher, and that will keep the trade balance from going out of whack. That was basically the original scheme all the way until 1980. And in 1980, advanced countries decided that cross-border capital flows should also be freed so that Japanese can easily buy US equities, Americans can easily buy Japanese bonds and things of that kind. Until 1980, it was actually quite difficult for Americans to buy Japanese equities or Japanese to buy US bonds. But that was all changed around 1980. And then all these investors are getting into the foreign exchange market because they realize that they want financial assets from other countries. And they basically dominated the foreign exchange market. Today, exporters and importers are said to be about 5% of the trade transactions. 95% is from all these portfolio investors. And as United States is having higher interest rates than Japan and Europe, the dollar remained very strong because everybody wanted to have these higher interest rates in the United States. So dollar remained very strong. Europeans and Japanese currencies stayed relatively weak. And as a result, US competitiveness was hurt very badly. And that's how you end up with all these Rust Belt phenomena in Midwest and so forth. But both Republicans and Democrats did not take much actions against this dollar that is too strong relative to the industrial competitiveness of the US industries. And as a result, deficit continued. Because investors are buying dollars, dollar remained strong relative to its competitiveness. And as a result, US trade deficit kept on, remained at very high levels, which was hurting a lot of people in the Midwest and those industries where they have to compete with imports.
Back in the day, I think it was the left wing of the Democratic Party that was in the United States that was opposing free trade to protect workers. And it was the Republican Party, as well as the more centrist Bill Clinton wing that passed all these free trade agreements. Now, in 2016, it was a Republican, Donald Trump, who led the charge in saying that this system where the U.S. runs a very large trade deficit, or as he said, we're losing at trade. It was a Republican, and now it appears somewhat bipartisan that the U.S. should do something about just how the Chinese exports and as you've written, President Biden has left a lot of Trump's tariffs in place. So do you think that it is a good thing that the United States is now somewhat fighting against the very large trade surpluses of the rest of the world, particularly China?
It was Donald Trump who apparently realized that there are a lot of Americans who are unhappy in the Rust Belt areas and other areas where they have to compete with foreign exporters. And these people really did not have much place to express their political voices because until Donald Trump came along, Democratic Party, even the Democratic Party was supposedly close to the trade unions, were not making a big issue out of trade deficit and allowed the dollar to remain relatively strong. Republicans, of course, before Donald Trump, was very much for free trade. And so all these people who were losing to imports were kind of left without a party to express their unhappiness or dissatisfaction. And apparently Trump realized that there's a huge number of people out there who are not very happy with the situation. And basically he capitalized on it by saying, hey, I'm here to help the industries, help the jobs. And suddenly all these people who had no place to express their dissatisfaction ended up joining the Trump camp. And that, I think, forced a lot of changes all over the United States in the sense that Hillary Clinton, back in 2016, she was also part of the negotiating team for Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP, which was a very advanced free trade agreement. Well, she had to distance herself from the TPP, even though she herself negotiated it, because she realized that the amount of dissatisfaction within the United States for free trade was so much larger than we were taught in universities. And if I may elaborate on that, what we are taught in universities is that free trade creates both winners and losers in the same country, but the gain of the winners are much larger than the losses of the losers. And so if you put them together, free trade benefits the whole country. And that's how it was taught in universities. And so we always assume that free trade creates more winners than losers. But these professors never taught us that that conclusion, that free trade always creates more winners than losers, is predicated on one assumption. And that assumption is that trade is either in balance or in surplus. If that's not the case, if that's the case, then the theory holds. But if the country continues to run deficit year after year after year, as happened in the United States for the last 40 years, the number of people who consider themselves losers of free trade continue to increase. And by 2016, that group was large enough to put Donald Trump into the White House. So that was a shock to the whole system. So Democratic Party and the Republican Party too had to completely readjust their positions on free trade. And of course, Donald Trump basically hijacked the Republican Party, and their first priority now is to defend American industries. And the Democrats too, as you mentioned earlier, Joe Biden kept most of the tariffs that Trump put in, added some of his own. So we are now paying the kind of price for allowing this trade deficit for this 40 years. But I am not happy with the way we are going, because the way it is argued in the political arena, in the sense that this is viewed as pushback on free trade. But I don't think this is a pushback on free trade. It's a pushback on overvalued dollar. Because if the dollar weren't so strong, the number of people who consider themselves losers of free trade would be much smaller in number, and it should have been more manageable. But because the dollar overvaluation of the dollar was kept in place for so long, this group kept on growing. And now they are changing the whole atmosphere on free trade. But if we lose free trade, and if we go back to the world with all these tariffs and retaliations and so forth, we go back to 1930s all over again. And we know how disastrous that was. So I would much prefer to see overvaluation of the dollar corrected, instead of just arbitrarily putting on tariffs on this goods and that goods, which is not good for the economic growth of this country or for the global economy.
So you want the chronic trade deficit of the United States to be fixed by a weaker dollar rather than tariffs. How successful do you think a Trump administration or a President Harris administration would be in reversing that? And do you think they would rely upon a weaker dollar, or do you think they would go through the tariff route?
This is a rather complicated issue. If Ms. Harris thinks that she can win the next election with just their traditional supporters, without trying to win back some of the people who left the Democratic Party and joined the Trump camp, then she probably will do nothing, or maybe just play with tariffs a little bit here and there. But if she felt that those people who used to be with Democrats now are with Trump, they have to be won back, she has to win back these people, then she will have to do something. Then one is the tariff, the other was the exchange rate. Since tariff has kind of become acceptable, maybe she would just go the easy route and play with some tariffs. But that would be hurting economic growth in this country as well the rest of the world, then we might actually end up in a situation like what happened in 1930s, which would be a disaster for everybody. But against this, some people are saying, I don't trash the dollar. If you trash the dollar, inflation rate will go up, and the fight against inflation will be even harder. Well, there's some truth to that, but keeping the dollar strong to fight inflation, in my view, is a very unfair way to fight inflation, because the people are already hurting, which is why these guys are supporting Trump. You're asking them to suffer even more, just so that inflation rates will be a little bit less than otherwise. And the Trump camp can use that against the Harris, if Harris went that way, by saying that this is a very unfair way of fighting inflation, because you're only squeezing already badly squeezed people even further, just so that some city developers, city dwellers, academics, financial types, service industries can enjoy slightly lower prices, but everybody else suffering. So this is one of those issues that political parties have to decide what is the right path forward. But from a perspective of economist, I much prefer to see overvaluation of dollar adjusted or reduced. To eliminate this completely, or to balance the bilateral trade with all the countries around the world, I think that's not possible. I mean, the genie is already out of the bottle, and the genie here, I mean, is this capital flows. But I think government can still do a lot to bring adjust exchange rates. And on that point, I like to refer to the Plaza Accord, September 1985. At that time, the dollar strength was so overwhelming. It was about 240 yen to the dollar. And U.S. was completely engulfed in protectionism. Everybody wanted protectionism because the dollar was so outrageously strong. Well, luckily, we had a free trader called Ronald Reagan, and he implemented what is known as the Plaza Accord to bring the dollar down. And even though most people were very skeptical at the beginning that government can actually move the exchange rate, when they did it, it worked beautifully. Exchange rate was 240 yen to the dollar at the time of the Plaza. 2 years later, it was 120 yen to the dollar. And the pickup in inflation there was a little bit, but it was minimal. And after that, for a while, because dollar was adjusted, protectionist pressures that was so strong by September of 1985 came down to a much more manageable level. But that turned out to be the very last time the U.S. had actually implemented a foreign exchange policy, because after that, the dollar was kind of left on its own, and because it was then start becoming overvalued again, and that basically is where we find ourselves today. Now, President Joe Biden once referred to this strong dollar by saying that, well, it's our currency, but it's their problem. Their problem meaning foreigners' problem. But that kind of attitude, I'm afraid, is not very good for all these people who are suffering from strong dollar in the United States. And if these people then take over the country and we ended up with the protectionism, inflation rate will be even worse. And so I hope more people understand that those people who are supporting Trump, unhappy with U.S. government not taking action to correct the overvaluation of the dollar, is really the victim of the overvaluation of the dollar, not the victim of free trade. And in order to save free trade, we should adjust the exchange of the dollar so that the number of people who are unhappy will be much reduced.
Thank you. So China is in balance sheet recession, and chronic trade deficits are not good for that home country, but you think the U.S. should resolve that issue by a weaker dollar and not tariffs. Richard, thank you so much. You've been very generous with your time. My final question for you is about the United States now. The US, as you know, has run a very large fiscal deficit since 2020 with the COVID stimulus. And you have a chart showing how US bank lending has been very high, and particularly much higher than many countries in Europe and I believe Japan too. So, do you think is the U.S. in a balance sheet expansion mode where the government and the private sector are leveraging and borrowing at the same time?
Well, the fiscal stimulus was needed during balance sheet recession because private sector was not borrowing money. So if the private sector is really coming back to borrow, then those fiscal stimulus are no longer needed, and so they should be cut down either by higher taxes or reduced spending. The flow of funds data and the bank lending data, I'm afraid, are not consistent yet. Flow of funds data still looks like U.S. private sector is not borrowing all that much. But the banking data that you referred to, and the one I referred to my recent report from Nomura Securities, does indicate that lending have picked up. If the flow funds data then agrees with the banking data, because flow funds data is revised a few times before it becomes final, then I think this is a time for the United States to start reducing its deficit, because the private sector is ready to take on the challenge. But if you look at Japan or Europe, for that matter, that is not happening. Private sector is still borrowing very little relative to the level of interest rates. They're still in financial surplus, which means the government has to run the financial deficit to offset that until private sector sources are ready to borrow again. And we haven't got there yet.
Well, Mr. Koo, thank you so much for joining us. People can find your many books, and they should check them out, such as The Holy Grail of Macroeconomics, and most recently, Pursued Economy. This is a fantastic book, and we cover many of the things we talked about: trade, balance sheet recession, but also the concept of a pursued economy and the 3 stages of a country's economic development. It is a very, very compelling idea, very relevant to everything that's going on. We didn't get a chance to talk about it today, but people should check out the book if they want to find that out. Richard, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you everyone for watching.
Thank you for having me.
Hi, everyone. As always, thanks for listening. As I said in the beginning, this was my last episode of Forward Guidance, and Felix Javin will be taking over as the host of Forward Guidance from here. I can honestly say that hosting Forward Guidance has been an honor and a true highlight of my life. Thank you to everyone who's been on this wild ride with me. Blockworks, my brilliant guests, Van Eck and all the other show's sponsors, and in particular, you, the audience. There have been quite a lot of you. Just on podcast apps and YouTube alone, you have watched Forward Guidance over 22 million times, and if you include Twitter, over 30 million times. And over 250 million times if you include YouTube impressions, which we don't because they're the EBITDA of podcasting. But the stat that I love the most is that since the show began nearly 3 years ago, you have watched and listened to Forward Guidance for a combined 7 million hours. All I can say is wow. Thank you so much for your time. I hope the knowledge and entertainment you've gained has been worthy of it. I started Forward Guidance right before the Federal Reserve raised interest rates from 0, and I'm leaving right before they're about to cut them. Many of you know my successor, Felix Javin. Some of you might not, but let me tell you just how sharp, insightful, and most of all, curious he is. He is a macro autodidact who is well prepared to take over as the host of Forward Guidance. He couldn't make a bad episode if he tried, and I'm excited to see where he takes the show, and you should be too. Thanks again for the journey of a lifetime.